On January 17, 1781, a British officer named Banastre Tarleton rode toward a cattle grazing field in upstate South Carolina with over 1,000 of the best trained soldiers in the British Army, and he was not nervous, and he was not cautious, and he had absolutely no reason to be either of those things because his target was a ragged force of American troops, half of whom were untrained militia, who had a well-documented reputation for running at the first sight of a bayonet charge, and who had done exactly that at Camden just a few months earlier when the British had sent 2,000 Americans fleeing in a matter of minutes. Tarleton expected an easy victory, and in his experience with American militia that expectation was entirely reasonable. What he rode into instead was one of the most perfectly executed tactical traps in the entire history of warfare, and within 60 minutes his elite force would be shattered with losses so catastrophic that military historians still double-check the numbers today because they barely seem possible even knowing every detail of how they happened. And the man who designed the trap was a backwoods general with no formal military education, who had spent the entire night before the battle crouched at campfires telling jokes to shivering farmhands and explaining his plan to every single man who would carry it out. To understand how this happened and why it matters, you need to understand what the American Revolution looked like in South Carolina in late 1780, because it looked like it was over, and not in a way that left much room for optimism. The British had captured Charleston in May, taking over 5,000 Continental soldiers prisoner in the worst American defeat of the entire war in a single catastrophic surrender that stripped the South of its best trained fighting force at exactly the moment when it needed that force most. British commander Lord Cornwallis controlled most of the southern colonies, and loyalist militias were terrorizing patriot families across the countryside with a brutality that had made the war in the South personal and visceral in a way it never quite was in the North, where the fighting had a more formal quality to it. General George Washington sent Nathaniel Greene to take command of whatever was left of the Southern Continental Army, and when Greene arrived, he found barely an army at all. Roughly 1,400 starving, poorly equipped regulars spread across the Carolina backcountry without enough food or shoes or ammunition to fight a serious engagement against the force Cornwallis could put in the field against them. Most commanders in Greene's position would have consolidated what little they had and waited for reinforcements before doing anything that might risk what remained of the army. Instead, Greene made a decision that most commanders would have called insane, and that his officers almost certainly questioned when he gave the order because it violated nearly every conventional principle of 18th century warfare. He split his already tiny force in two in the face of a superior enemy and sent about 600 troops west under the command of Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. And if you do not know who Daniel Morgan was, then you need to understand that he was perhaps the least likely military genius in American history, and that his entire biography reads like a deliberate argument against the idea that formal education and aristocratic connections are what produce great military commanders. No wealthy family, no aristocratic connections, no formal training of any kind. He had grown up poor in the Shenandoah Valley, working as a teamster hauling supplies through the wilderness and doing the kind of physical labor that builds the body and the mind in ways that no classroom can replicate. During the French and Indian War, he received 500 lashes from a British officer for punching a superior, and the scars covered his entire back for the rest of his life, and Morgan reportedly joked that the British still owed him one lash because the drummer had miscounted and lost track of the number somewhere in the middle of the punishment. That is the kind of detail that tells you everything you need to know about Daniel Morgan as a human being. A man who could joke about 500 lashes was a man with the kind of psychological resilience that no amount of formal education or aristocratic upbringing could produce. And that kind of man does not forget a debt, and does not forgive one either. When the Revolution started, Morgan showed up with a company of Virginia riflemen and fought in nearly every major engagement of the northern campaigns from the siege of Quebec, where he took a musket ball through the neck, and kept fighting to the forests of Saratoga, where his sharpshooters helped shatter Burgoyne's army piece by piece in the kind of irregular warfare that the British had no effective answer for. And by 1780, he carried something that was worth more than any formal military education, something that no amount of classroom instruction could replicate or replace. He understood exactly how ordinary men behaved under fire, and that understanding was about to become the most dangerous thing the British Army in the South had ever encountered. Morgan had fought alongside militia at Saratoga and watched what happened when you asked untrained men to do things they were not trained or equipped to do. He had also watched militia units panic and flee at Camden, where a British bayonet charge sent over 2,000 Americans running in minutes, and the entire American position collapsed before most of the men had even had time to understand what was happening. And Morgan understood something that most Continental officers refused to accept, because it was an uncomfortable truth that challenged the way they thought about battle and about the men under their command. Militia were not cowards, and that word should never be used to describe what happened at Camden or at any of the other engagements where they had broken and run. They were untrained civilians carrying muskets who had been asked to do something that professional soldiers with years of drilling and experience found difficult even under the best conditions. Asking them to stand in an open field and trade volleys with British regulars was like asking a high school football team to hold the line against an NFL defense and expecting them to succeed because they wanted it badly enough. It was not a question of courage or of wanting to fight. It was a question of capability and of training and of what a human being can actually do when a line of professional soldiers with fixed bayonets is charging at them across open ground. And that honest assessment of what his men could and could not do, that refusal to pretend his militia were something they were not, became the entire foundation of the trap Morgan was about to build on a cattle pasture in the Carolina backcountry. And it would produce a victory so complete and so decisive that military academies around the world would still be teaching it more than 2 centuries later as one of the most elegant examples of tactical genius in recorded history. When Morgan learned that Tarleton was pursuing him with a fast-moving force of over 1,000 British regulars, dragoons, and loyalist infantry, he had a choice that most generals of his era would have made without much deliberation. He could run and try to link back up with Greene and avoid the fight entirely. The conventional wisdom of the time would have supported that decision without question, because fighting a superior force on open ground with untrained militia was not a recipe for anything except the kind of defeat that had already been visited on American forces in the South too many times in too short a period. Instead, Morgan stopped at a place called the Cowpens, a well-known cattle pasture in the rolling grasslands of northern South Carolina where local farmers had been grazing their herds for years, and his officers were confused by the choice in a way that suggests they were not fully comfortable raising the question directly with a man of Morgan's temperament and reputation. The position looked terrible by every conventional standard of 18th century military doctrine. The broad river sat about 5 miles behind them, cutting off any route of retreat that his militia might use when the battle turned against them. Open ground stretched in every direction, offering no natural fortification, and no dense forest to hide in, and no swamp to slow a cavalry charge. Nothing that any military manual of the period would have recognized as a defensible position. Morgan chose this ground on purpose, and the reason behind that choice was as counterintuitive and as brilliant as everything else he did in the planning of this battle. He did not want his militia to have an escape route, and the reason was devastatingly simple. He knew with the certainty of a man who had watched it happen before, and who was honest enough with himself to acknowledge what he had seen, that if they could run they would run, not because they were cowards, but because running is what untrained men do when the pressure becomes overwhelming and there is a road behind them and nobody has given them a specific reason to stay. By putting a river at their backs, he removed the option entirely and changed the calculation in every man's mind in a way that no speech about courage or honor could have accomplished. Fight or drown, those were the only choices available on the morning of January 17th. But Morgan was not asking his militia to do anything suicidal, and he was not asking them to be something they were not. He was asking them to do something very specific and very simple and very temporary, something that they were entirely capable of doing if they understood what was required of them. And he spent the entire night before the battle walking from campfire to campfire across the frozen ground, personally explaining the plan to every single unit in his army in a way that was almost without precedent in 18th century military leadership. He crouched down with groups of shivering militiamen at their fires and told them jokes about the British and shared stories about fighting at Saratoga and laid out exactly what he needed from each man in terms that were concrete and specific and achievable. He told the militia they would not have to face a bayonet charge and they would not have to stand their ground until the last man fell. He told them they would fire 2 shots and walk away with their honor intact and with the knowledge that they had done their part in a plan that was going to work if everyone did exactly what Morgan was asking them to do. Nothing more and nothing less. He told the regulars they were the wall that nothing would get past, and he walked among the cavalry and told them they would be the ones to deliver the killing blow that would end the battle and that history would remember. And by dawn every soldier on that field knew exactly what he was supposed to do and exactly when he was supposed to do it and exactly why the plan would work if each man played his part at the right moment. And that level of personal leadership the night before a battle was almost entirely without precedent in the 18th century, when generals gave orders through staff officers and never crouched at a private's campfire to explain their thinking to a man who had been farming corn 6 weeks earlier. Picture the battlefield from above, and picture it carefully because the geometry of this trap is what makes it so remarkable. Roughly 1,000 yards of gently sloping open ground rising toward 2 low hills with nothing to break the sight lines and nothing to slow an advancing force. Morgan arranged his forces in 3 deliberate lines, each one set roughly 150 yards behind the last, and every single line had a specific job that it would perform at a specific moment in a sequence that would only work if every piece moved exactly when Morgan needed it to move, and every man did exactly what he had been told to do at those campfires the night before. The first line was a thin screen of about 150 select riflemen from Georgia and the Carolinas, and these were not militia in the traditional sense of the word, but frontier marksmen who had grown up hunting in forests where accuracy at distance was a matter of survival, and who could hit a target at 250 yards with a long rifle in a way that British regular infantry with their smooth-bore muskets simply could not match at that range. Morgan placed them out front with one specific instruction that was both simple and psychologically devastating in its implications: pick off the officers. When the British begin their advance, shoot the epaulets and target the men on horseback, and target anyone giving orders, because an army without officers is a mob, and a mob is something you can destroy. The second line was the main militia force, roughly 300 men from the Carolinas under Andrew Pickens. And this is where Morgan's genius showed itself most clearly, because the decision he made about how to use these men was the decision that made everything else possible, and that separated his approach from every other general who had tried to use militia in the South and failed. He did not ask these men to hold their ground, and did not ask them to stand and fight to the death against an advancing line of professional soldiers with fixed bayonets, because he knew what that would produce, and he was not willing to repeat the mistakes that had been made at Camden and at every other engagement where American commanders had asked militia to do what they were not equipped to do. He asked them to do exactly two things, and only two things, and he was very clear and very specific about both of them: fire 2 aimed volleys at the British when they came within 50 yards, and then turn around and walk to the left, cycling behind the third line and reforming in the rear. That was the entire assignment: 2 shots and leave. He told them to their faces, just give me 2 good fires, boys, and then you can fall back. And the simplicity and the achievability of that instruction was itself a form of genius, because it transformed what every militia soldier feared most into something he could actually do. The third line was the backbone of the entire position. About 450 Continental regulars and tough Virginia militia under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard positioned on the first low rise behind the militia line. These were the men who had been trained to stand in a firing line and trade volleys with British infantry for extended periods, and they were the anvil of the trap that Morgan was constructing, the surface against which he intended to break the British force. And hidden behind the second hill, completely out of sight from any approaching force, sat the hammer that would deliver the blow that ended the battle. Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, a cousin of George Washington, waited with roughly 80 Continental dragoons and 45 mounted militia cavalry in a position where they could not be seen from the British line of march and could not be detected until they were already moving at full gallop toward an enemy that had no idea they existed. It was a killing blow that nobody would see coming until it was far too late to respond to it, and it was the piece of the plan that Morgan held back in reserve for the moment when the British were most vulnerable and least prepared to deal with a new threat coming from an unexpected direction. Now picture this from Tarleton's perspective, because understanding his perspective is what makes the trap comprehensible. He had been chasing Morgan for days across frozen South Carolina backcountry, pushing his men at a brutal pace that reflected his belief that speed and aggression would catch a retreating force before it could find a defensible position or join up with Greene's main army. On the night of January 16th, he roused his troops at 2 in the morning and forced them to march through pitch darkness across swollen creeks and muddy cattle trails for nearly 8 miles before dawn in conditions that would have tested the endurance of soldiers who were well fed and well rested. His men had barely eaten, and many had not slept more than a few hours, and horses were stumbling from exhaustion, and infantry were dragging their feet through frozen mud in a way that should have prompted any careful commander to stop and rest before engaging. Tarleton was 26 years old and aggressive to the point of recklessness, and he had earned his reputation as the most feared British cavalry commander in the colonies through a series of engagements that had confirmed his belief in the power of speed and shock to break American resistance before it could organize itself into anything serious. At the Battle of Waxhaw the year before, his dragoons had cut down surrendering American soldiers in a massacre that earned him the nickname Bloody Tarleton among the colonists, and that had made him the most hated British officer in the South by a considerable margin. Caution did not interest him, and reconnaissance did not interest him, and holding a meaningful reserve did not interest him, because in his experience American militia crumbled under a hard, fast assault before any of those precautions became necessary, and the faster you hit them, the less time they had to run in an organized way. His scouts reported that Morgan's force was deployed on open ground with a river behind them, and Tarleton saw exactly what Morgan wanted him to see: a trapped, outnumbered American force with nowhere to run that had made the mistake of choosing a position from which there was no escape. It looked like a gift, and it looked like exactly the kind of situation that Tarleton had been pursuing Morgan across frozen South Carolina to create. He ordered an immediate attack without waiting for his troops to rest, and without conducting a proper reconnaissance, and without holding any meaningful reserve, because none of those things had ever been necessary before, and he had no reason to believe they would be necessary now. The British advanced across the frozen pasture at first light, and the first thing they encountered was the skirmish line of riflemen, who opened fire from long range in a way that was immediately different from anything Tarleton's men had experienced before. Shots cracked across the field with a precision that smooth-bore muskets could not match at that distance, and British officers started falling from their horses with a regularity that was both devastating and deeply unnerving to the men. Watching their leaders drop around them, a captain dropped, and then a sergeant, and the riflemen fired and reloaded with the practiced speed of men who had been doing this in the forest since childhood, and fired again, and then melted backward toward the second line exactly as Morgan had planned at the campfires the night before. The British pressed forward because the sight of the riflemen falling back confirmed everything they believed about this engagement. The enemy was giving ground, and a force that gives ground is a force that is breaking. They could see the militia line ahead of them, a thin formation of rough-looking men in civilian clothes with nothing about their appearance to suggest that they were anything other than exactly the kind of undisciplined colonial rabble that the British had learned to despise and to defeat without much difficulty. This was the moment British regulars had been trained their entire careers to exploit: the charge against undisciplined colonials who would break and flee at the sight of fixed bayonets and the sound of drums. The drums beat the advance, and the redcoats leveled their bayonets and surged forward with a shout that was as much psychological weapon as military tactic, designed to terrify men who had no experience standing in the face of a professional charge, and who had every reason to believe that running was the only reasonable response to what was coming toward them. At 50 yards Pickens gave the order, and the militia line erupted with 300 muskets firing into the British ranks at close range in a volley that was devastating in a way that Tarleton's officers had not anticipated and had not prepared their men to absorb. Entire sections of the British line crumpled, and men dropped in rows, and the smoke from 300 simultaneous discharges rolled across the field in a thick gray curtain that reduced visibility to almost nothing for the seconds it took the militia to reload. And before the haze even cleared, the militia fired a second volley into the staggering British formation, and then, exactly as Morgan had told them to do at those campfires the previous night, they turned and began moving to the left, heading around the back of the Continental line. Some of them jogged and some of them walked, and a few looked back over their shoulders at the screaming redcoats surging toward them, but they moved together as a unit following the route Morgan had walked them through the previous night, and they had done exactly what they were asked to do: 2 good fires, and now they were leaving the stage as planned. And this is where Tarleton made the fatal mistake that Morgan had been counting on from the moment he looked at a map and chose this piece of ground. When the British saw the militia turning and moving away from the line, they interpreted it as a rout because it looked exactly like every other time they had advanced against American militia, and the Americans had broken and run. The line had broken, and this was Camden all over again, and officers shouted for the pursuit, and a surge of pure adrenaline tore through the British ranks, and the disciplined advance that Tarleton had organized dissolved into a full-speed charge with regimental cohesion gone entirely, and officers losing control of their formations completely, and soldiers sprinting forward in a mob heading uphill to finish off what every instinct and every prior experience told them was a fleeing, demoralized enemy who had lost the will to fight. They crested the low-rise, screaming bayonets forward and ran directly into John Eager Howard's Continental line, standing shoulder to shoulder in a formation that had not moved and had not wavered, and was waiting for this exact moment with muskets loaded and aimed at a range where it was almost impossible to miss. Howard waited until the charging, disordered British mass was at nearly point-blank range, and then gave the order to fire, and the volley hit the disorganized charge like a physical wall. And men fell by the dozen in the space of a single second, and before the survivors could even begin to process what had happened, Howard ordered a bayonet charge directly into the stunned and scattered British front. At that exact moment, Colonel William Washington's cavalry thundered out from behind the second hill and smashed into the British right flank at full gallop, with sabers swinging and driving straight into the exposed side of a formation that was already reeling from the frontal assault and had no reserves and no prepared response to a cavalry charge from an unexpected direction. The British line buckled and began to collapse, and then came the final piece of the trap that Morgan had designed the night before at those campfires. The militia who Tarleton had believed were routing had marched around the back of the Continental line exactly as planned, and now reappeared on the opposite side of the field, reformed into a rough firing line and advancing with loaded muskets toward a British force that was being hit from 3 directions simultaneously. From the front by Howard's bayonet charge, and from the right by Washington's cavalry, and now from the left by the men they had just watched running away minutes earlier. A full double envelopment executed by farmers and shopkeepers and backwoods riflemen against one of the most professional armies on earth. The British army broke not slowly and not in stages, but all at once, in the way that armies break when the situation becomes completely and irreversibly hopeless. Soldiers threw down their muskets and put their hands up, and officers tried to rally pockets of resistance, and were cut down or surrounded within minutes, and some British regulars fought in desperate clusters back to back until they were overwhelmed, and others simply dropped to their knees because there was nothing else left to do. Tarleton himself attempted a cavalry countercharge with his small reserve of dragoons, but Washington's horsemen met him head-on, and two officers actually clashed personally on horseback before Tarleton managed to break free and escape with a handful of mounted soldiers fleeing the field at a dead gallop. The battle lasted roughly 1 hour, and in that time Morgan's force killed or wounded over 300 British soldiers and captured nearly 600 more, including entire artillery crews and their cannons. Tarleton lost over 80% of his command, and American losses were 12 dead and 60 wounded. The numbers almost defy belief, and that is not a figure of speech because military historians actually double-check them against multiple sources because the kill ratio barely seems possible even when you understand exactly how it was achieved. Morgan did not just win a battle. He destroyed an entire British tactical force with a fraction of the casualties, and he did it by doing something that sounds obvious when you describe it afterward, but that almost no general in the history of warfare has had the clarity and the honesty to actually execute in practice. He took the greatest weakness of his army and turned it into the centerpiece of the trap, rather than trying to hide that weakness or compensate for it with something it was not. He used the militia's retreat as bait and made the British believe they were winning at the exact moment they were walking into the mechanism that would destroy them. Every line and every movement and every withdrawal was choreographed to pull the British deeper into a kill zone they did not recognize until it had already closed around them on 3 sides. He did not fight the battle the British expected to fight, and did not fight the battle that military convention would have suggested he fight. He designed a battle that the British could not resist, and then let their own aggression and their own assumptions and their own contempt for American militia destroy them. Cowpens broke the back of British strategy in the south in a single morning, and Cornwallis lost a quarter of his light troops and his most aggressive field commander, and the psychological impact on British command in the south was just as devastating as the material losses because the entire British approach had been built on the assumption that American militia would always break under pressure, and that assumption had just been proven catastrophically wrong in a way that could not be explained away or dismissed as a fluke. Cornwallis was furious and burned his own supply wagons in a desperate attempt to lighten his army and chase Greene north into Virginia, and that pursuit stretched his supply lines to the breaking point and exhausted his remaining troops and pulled him further and further from his bases of support until it ultimately led him to a small tobacco port on the Chesapeake called Yorktown, where a combined American and French force surrounded him that October, and the rest of that story is well known to anyone who has studied the Revolution. Military academies around the world still teach Cowpens as a case study in the double envelopment and in understanding your own forces and in using an enemy's aggression as a weapon against them. Hannibal did something similar at Cannae in 216 BC, luring the Roman legions into a pocket by allowing his center to bend inward while his flanks closed around them. But Hannibal had veteran Carthaginian infantry who had spent years training for exactly that kind of sophisticated maneuver. Morgan did it with men who had been farming corn 6 weeks earlier on a cattle field in the Carolina backcountry. Tarleton spent the rest of the war trying to explain what happened and blamed everyone except himself. His superiors blamed him for charging without reconnaissance. Cornwallis blamed the entire collapse of the Southern campaign on the losses of that morning. The reality is that none of them were prepared for what Morgan built on that frozen field, because the trap was so elegant and so perfectly calibrated to exploit exactly the assumptions and the instincts and the prior experiences that Tarleton carried onto that field that the enemy did exactly what Morgan needed them to do at every single stage and never realized it until it was completely over. Write in the comments which part of this changed how you see Cowpens, because I want to know exactly when you realized that the militia retreat was not a failure of nerve but the entire point of the plan.